There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a very old land once the sun has gone down, a stillness that has nothing urgent in it, nothing that asks to be solved before morning, and it is in that stillness that we begin tonight, drifting slowly backward across thousands of years, past the noise of modern cities and modern roads, until the ground beneath us turns to loess and river silt, and the sky above us is lit only by stars that have not yet been given names in any language we would recognize. Tonight we are going to walk, without hurry, through the long and patient story of ancient China, a civilization that did not arrive all at once but grew the way a river valley grows, season after season, flood after flood, until the fields were rich enough and the villages were settled enough for something larger to take shape. We will move slowly through the millennia, resting often, lingering on details rather than racing toward conclusions, because the purpose of this journey is not to arrive anywhere in particular but simply to keep drifting, chapter by chapter, deeper into rest. There is no need to remember every name or every date that will pass through this story tonight. Let the words wash over you the way a slow river washes over smooth stone, wearing away nothing, changing nothing, simply moving. If your eyes grow heavy before we reach the end, that is exactly as it should be, because this is not a lecture meant to be studied but a long, unhurried bedtime companion meant to carry you gently toward sleep. China, as a word and as an idea, did not exist for most of the story we are about to tell. The people who lived through these centuries did not think of themselves as citizens of a single unbroken civilization stretching toward some distant future. They thought mostly of their own village, their own family, their own field, and the particular bend of the particular river that fed it. It is only from the great distance of the present, looking backward across so much time, that all of these small and scattered lives begin to resemble a single continuous story, the way 1,000 separate lamps, seen from far enough away on a dark night, begin to resemble a single glow. So let us begin where the story itself begins, along the banks of two great rivers, the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze in the south, whose slow and steady floods laid down the soil in which the very first Chinese villages would eventually take root. We will not rush toward the emperors and the wars, not yet. First, we will simply sit for a while beside the water, and watch the very beginning of everything unfold as slowly as it actually happened. Settle now, if you can, a little more deeply into whatever surface is holding you tonight. Let your shoulders soften, let your breathing find its own slow, unhurried rhythm, and let go gently of whatever the day has left sitting in your mind. Nothing that follows requires anything of you except your quiet, half-attentive presence, the same easy presence you might bring to watching a fire slowly burn down, or listening to rain settle onto a distant roof. We have a very long night ahead of us, and nowhere in particular we need to be by the end of it. Long before there were dynasties or emperors or written records of any kind, there were simply people learning to live beside water, and the water they lived beside was some of the most demanding and most generous water on the entire continent. The Yellow River, which the Chinese would eventually call Huang He, carried with it enormous quantities of fine yellow silt scraped from the highlands far to the west, and wherever that silt settled, the soil became soft and fertile and endlessly patient with the hands of early farmers. Around 7,000 years ago, small communities began to cluster along these riverbanks, communities that we now group loosely under names like the Yangshao culture in the middle reaches of the Yellow River and, somewhat later, the Longshan culture that followed it. These were not empires, not even kingdoms in the way we would later understand the word, but simple villages of packed earthhouses, storage pits for grain, and small cemeteries where the dead were laid to rest with a handful of pottery vessels, painted slowly by hand with spirals and fish and geometric bands that still, thousands of years later, feel strangely calm to look upon. The rhythm of life in these villages moved with the seasons in a way that modern life rarely does. Millet was the staple grain of the north, hardy enough to survive the cold, dry winters of the Yellow River Valley, and it was planted in spring, tended through summer, and harvested in autumn by families who had little concept of history stretching out behind them, only the immediate and pressing knowledge of when the rains would come and when the frost would arrive. A typical Yangshao settlement, of the kind excavated at sites like Banpo near modern Xi'an, might have held several hundred people living in round or square semi-subterranean houses, their floors dug slightly below ground level for warmth, their walls made of wattle and daub packed over a wooden frame, their roofs thatched thickly against the rain. At the center of such a village there was often a larger communal building, used perhaps for gatherings, perhaps for rituals whose exact meaning has long since been lost, and around the settlement's edge, a ditch was sometimes dug, not for war, most archaeologists believe, but simply to keep wandering livestock in and wild animals out, a boundary line as gentle in purpose as a garden fence. Further south, along the warmer and wetter banks of the Yangtze River, a different staple took root, one that would eventually feed more people than any other crop in human history: rice. Archaeologists digging in places like the Himudu site have found rice husks pressed into ancient pottery and preserved in waterlogged soil for more than 7,000 years, evidence of some of the earliest deliberate rice cultivation anywhere on Earth. The southern villages, built on stilts above the marshy ground, developed their own slow rhythm, one governed by the flooding of paddies rather than the dryness of northern fields. Life along the Yangtze moved to a gentler, wetter cadence than life along the Yellow River. Where northern farmers watched the sky anxiously for rain that might never come, southern farmers managed an abundance of water, channeling it carefully between paddies, adjusting small earthen dams by hand, coaxing the rice to grow in flooded fields that shimmered, in the right light, like long strips of pale gray glass laid across the green landscape. Fish and waterfowl supplemented the rice harvest, and boats, simple dugout canoes at first, became as essential to daily life in the south as carts and paths were in the drier north. It would be many centuries before these scattered river communities began to grow into something larger, but the pattern had already been set. Wherever there was water and workable soil, people gathered, and wherever people gathered for long enough, in peace more often than in conflict, something like the beginnings of civilization began quietly to take shape, unnoticed by anyone living through it, the way a single night's rain is unnoticed until, years later, someone looks back and sees a forest. By the later Longshan period, roughly 4,500 to 4,000 years ago, these villages had grown noticeably larger and more complex. Some settlements were now surrounded by substantial rammed earth walls, built by pounding layers of moist soil between wooden frames until the resulting barrier was as hard and durable as stone, a labor-intensive technique that would remain in use for city walls and building foundations for thousands of years afterward. Distinctive black pottery, thin-walled and elegantly finished on a fast-spinning wheel, replaced the painted red wares of earlier centuries, and the presence of finely carved jade ornaments in some burials, while their absence in others, suggests that Chinese society, even at this early date, had begun to sort itself gently into those who held more and those who held less, the earliest quiet stirrings of the social hierarchies that would come to define the dynasties still centuries away. As the river villages grew larger and began to trade with one another, exchanging jade, pottery, and eventually bronze, the loose network of settlements slowly organized itself into something resembling a chiefdom, and then, according to the earliest Chinese historical traditions, into something resembling a dynasty. The first of these was said to be the Xia, a ruling house whose existence sits at the delicate border between legend and verified history, much the way early morning light sits at the border between night and day, present but not yet fully distinct. Chinese tradition remembers the founding of the Xia through the figure of Yu the Great, a man credited not with conquest but with something far more patient and far more suited to the tone of our story tonight: the taming of a flood. According to the old accounts, the Yellow River had once overflowed so catastrophically that entire regions were rendered uninhabitable, and Yu's own father had spent years trying and failing to dam the waters. Yu himself took a different approach, choosing not to block the flood but to guide it, digging channels that let the water flow where it wished to go, patiently redirecting rather than resisting, and it was said that he labored at this task for 13 years without once returning home, so devoted was he to the slow, unglamorous work of managing water. The old stories linger, with evident admiration, on small details of Yu's patience, that he passed by the gate of his own house 3 separate times during those 13 years and did not stop, even when he could hear his newborn son crying inside, because the work of the channels could not wait for rest, and the fields downstream could not wait for comfort. Whether or not the story happened exactly as later generations told it, the values it was meant to teach are unmistakable, and strangely fitting for a night spent easing towards sleep. That patience outlasts force, that water yields to guidance rather than resistance, and that the quiet, repeated labor of many ordinary days is what ultimately holds a civilization together. For his patience, Yu was eventually recognized as a ruler, and the dynasty he is said to have founded, the Xia, is remembered by tradition as lasting for several centuries, from roughly the 21st century before our era down to around 1600 BCE. Archaeological excavations at a site called Erlitou, in the Yellow River Valley, have revealed a sophisticated Bronze Age settlement with palace foundations, ritual bronze vessels, and organized workshops dating to almost exactly this period. And many historians now believe that Erlitou represents, if not the Xia dynasty exactly as later texts described it, at least a very early and very real state-level society from which the Xia legends eventually grew. The palace foundations at Erlitou, uncovered slowly over decades of careful excavation, describe a rectangular platform of rammed earth roughly the size of several modern city blocks, surrounded by a covered corridor and approached through a formal gateway. The earliest known example of the kind of palace and courtyard architecture that would remain a recognizable feature of Chinese elite buildings for the following 3,500 years. Nearby workshops show evidence of organized bronze casting on a scale that required significant coordination of labor and resources, hinting at a society with rulers capable of directing large public works, tax-like tribute, and skilled craft production, even if we will never know the names of most of the people who lived and worked there. Whether we call it the Xia or simply an unnamed early kingdom, what matters for our slow journey tonight is the picture it leaves behind. A society that had learned to organize labor on a large scale, to cast bronze for both ritual and practical purposes, and to pass authority from one generation to the next in a way that already resembled the dynastic pattern that would define Chinese history for the next 3,500 years. Sometime around 1600 BCE, the shadowy Xia gave way to a dynasty whose existence is no longer in question, confirmed not by legend but by thousands of inscribed fragments of bone and shell pulled patiently from the earth by archaeologists over the past century. This was the Shang dynasty, and it is with the Shang that Chinese history, in the fullest sense of written, datable, verifiable history, truly begins. The Shang kings ruled from a series of capitals in the Yellow River Valley, the most famous of which, Yin, near modern Anyang, has yielded an extraordinary archive of what are now called oracle bones. These were the shoulder blades of oxen or the undersides of turtle shells, prepared by court diviners who would apply a heated bronze point to the surface until it cracked, then interpret the pattern of the cracks as an answer from ancestral spirits to whatever question the king had posed. Afterward, a scribe would carefully carve the question and sometimes the answer into the bone itself, in a script that is unmistakably the ancestor of modern Chinese writing. The questions preserved on these bones read like a quiet window into the daily concerns of Bronze Age royalty. Whether the harvest would be good, whether it would rain within the next 10 days, whether a certain ancestor was displeased, whether a military campaign would succeed, whether a member of the royal family would recover from illness or survive childbirth. There is something deeply calming in reading them now, not because the concerns themselves were small, but because they remind us that the anxieties of any era, however distant, are made of the same soft material: weather, health, family, and the uncertain future. The process of divination itself was unhurried and deliberate, almost ceremonial in its patience. A prepared bone or shell would be brought before the king, a diviner would speak the question aloud, sometimes phrasing it twice, once in the positive and once in the negative, so that the ancestors might answer either way, and then the heated point would be applied slowly, again and again if necessary, to different spots along the bone's surface, each application producing its own small, sharp crack, its own small, separate answer. Afterward, the bones were not discarded but stored, carefully, in pits near the palace, thousands upon thousands of them accumulating over generations, an unintentional archive that would sleep undisturbed in the earth for more than 3,000 years before modern excavation brought it back into the light. Beyond writing, the Shang are remembered above all for their mastery of bronze casting, an art they brought to a level of technical sophistication that would not be matched elsewhere in the ancient world for a very long time. Massive ritual vessels, some weighing several hundred pounds, were cast using complex piece mold techniques, decorated with stylized animal faces called tao tai that stare outward from the bronze with an expression somewhere between a guardian and a dream. These vessels were not decorative in the way we might display a vase today. They were used in solemn ceremonies to offer food and wine to royal ancestors, whose goodwill was believed to be essential to the continued prosperity of the state. Casting a single large bronze vessel required an extraordinary coordination of specialized labor. Miners to extract copper, tin, and lead or from distant hills, smelters to refine the raw metal over carefully tended charcoal fires, modelers to sculpt the original clay form, mold makers to press section piece molds around that form and fire them until hard, and finally casters to pour the molten alloy, at just the right temperature, into the assembled mold, timed precisely so the metal would fill every fine detail of the tao tai pattern before it began to cool. A single mistake at any stage of this long process could ruin months of preceding work, and the fact that Shang workshops produced vessels of such consistent, extraordinary quality speaks to a depth of accumulated technical knowledge passed carefully from master to apprentice across many patient generations. Shang society was organized around a king who served simultaneously as political ruler and chief intermediary with the ancestral spirits, supported by a class of nobles, diviners, and craftsmen, and resting upon a much larger population of farmers who worked the land and, when called upon, formed the backbone of the army. Women, too, held positions of real consequence within this world, a fact made vivid by the 11th century BCE tomb of Fu Hao, a consort of King Wu Ding, discovered undisturbed near Anyang and found to contain not only exquisite bronze vessels and jade ornaments but inscriptions describing her as a military commander who led troops of several thousand soldiers into battle on the king's behalf. A quiet reminder that the roles available to Bronze Age women were not always as narrow as later, more rigid centuries would assume. For roughly 6 centuries, the Shang dynasty expanded, contracted, moved its capital more than once in response to flooding or political upheaval, and slowly wove together the river valleys of the north into a single, if loosely governed, cultural sphere. Agriculture remained the quiet foundation beneath all of this ritual and craft. Millet, wheat, and increasingly rice from southern contact fed a growing population, while domesticated pigs, dogs, and cattle provided both food and, on ceremonial occasions, offerings to the same ancestors whose favor was sought through the cracking of bones. By the 11th century before our era, however, the Shang court had grown, according to later tradition, increasingly extravagant and disconnected from the concerns of its own people, and to the west, along a tributary of the Yellow River, a rival people known as the Zhou were quietly gathering strength, waiting, as patient rivers do, for the right moment to change the course of the land. In 1046 BCE, according to the most widely accepted chronology, the forces of the Zhou people, led by a ruler remembered as King Wu, met the armies of the last Shang king at a place called Mai and defeated them decisively, bringing the 6th century rule of the Shang dynasty to an end. What followed was not simply a change of ruling family but the introduction of an idea that would shape Chinese political thought for the next 3,000 years. The concept of the mandate of heaven. The Zhou justified their conquest by explaining that heaven, a broad and impersonal moral force rather than a single deity, granted the right to rule only to those sovereigns who governed with virtue and care for their people. The last kings of the Shang, the Zhou argued, had grown cruel and indulgent, and heaven had therefore withdrawn its favor from them and transferred it to the more virtuous Zhou. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the earliest and most enduring theories of political legitimacy in world history, and it carried within it a gentle but permanent warning. The mandate could always be withdrawn again from anyone if a ruler failed to govern well. This idea would echo through every subsequent Chinese dynasty for millennia, offering a strangely calm and orderly explanation for even the most turbulent transitions of power. Droughts, floods, earthquakes, and peasant uprisings all came, in time, to be read as visible signs of heaven's displeasure, an omen that the mandate was slipping away from a failing ruler, while a new dynasty's rise to power was read, in turn, as confirmation that heaven had already made its quiet choice. In this way, the mandate of heaven gave Chinese history a kind of built-in rhythm, a slow pulse of rise and decline that later historians would describe, almost like the changing of seasons, as the dynastic cycle. The early Zhou kings, ruling from their capital near modern Xi'an in what is now called the Western Zhou period, organized their growing territory through a system that resembled, in its broad outlines, a kind of feudalism. Members of the royal family and loyal allies were granted control over regional territories, expected to pay tribute and offer military support to the king in exchange for local autonomy, a system that allowed Zhou influence to spread gradually across a much wider area than the Shang had ever directly controlled. The Duke of Zhou, brother of the victorious King Wu, is remembered with particular warmth in Chinese tradition for the way he handled the fragile years immediately following the conquest. When King Wu died only a few years after defeating the Shang, leaving behind a young and inexperienced heir, the Duke of Zhou served patiently as regent, resisting, according to later accounts, any temptation to seize the throne for himself, and eventually stepping aside once the young king was old enough to rule in his own right. For this quiet demonstration of restraint, later Confucian scholars would hold him up for centuries as the very model of loyal, virtuous statesmanship, a calm counterweight to the more dramatic and self-interested figures who populate so much of ancient history elsewhere in the world. Life in these early Zhou territories continued to move at the unhurried pace of an agricultural society, governed by the turning of the seasons and by ritual observances meant to keep both the ancestors and heaven itself content. Poetry from this period, later collected in the anthology known as the Book of Songs, preserves the voices of ordinary farmers and soldiers and young lovers alongside hymns composed for royal ceremonies, and reading these poems today, one is struck by how familiar the small concerns of daily life remain across such an enormous distance of time. A woman waiting for her husband to return from military service, a farmer watching for the first frost, a young man gathering reeds by a quiet river. One such poem describes, in simple and unhurried language, the labor of an entire farming year month by month. The mending of tools in late winter, the plowing of fields in early spring, the gathering of mulberry leaves for silkworms in summer, the harvesting of grain in autumn, and finally, as the cold months return, the brewing of wine and the mending of roofs before the household settles in to wait out another winter together. There is no drama in these lines, no great event to mark the passage of the year, only the same patient cycle repeating itself, family after family, generation after generation, across the whole breadth of the Zhou domain. For roughly 3 centuries, the Western Zhou held its loosely federated territories together, but by 771 BCE, weakened by internal succession disputes and outside pressure from nomadic groups along its western frontier, the Zhou court was forced to abandon its original capital and move eastward, beginning a new and considerably less centralized phase of the dynasty that historians call the Eastern Zhou, a period during which real political power would slip slowly away from the royal house and into the hands of regional lords. The move of the Zhou capital eastward in 771 BCE opened a new and considerably longer chapter in the story of ancient China, one that historians divide, for convenience, into 2 long phases. The Spring and Autumn period, named after a terse chronicle of the state of Lu that recorded events year by year, and the later, more openly violent Warring States period that followed it. Together these 2 phases span more than 5 centuries, and although the Zhou kings continued to reign in name throughout almost all of this time, their real authority steadily diminished, until eventually they governed little more than a small ceremonial territory surrounded by increasingly powerful and independent regional states. During the Spring and Autumn period itself, which lasted roughly from 770 to 403 BCE, the political landscape of the Chinese world came to resemble a loose gathering of competing courts, each nominally still loyal to the distant Zhou king, each still performing the old rituals of tribute and homage, and yet each also quietly building its own army, its own administration, and its own ambitions. Historians count anywhere from dozens to well over 100 separate states active at the beginning of this period, ranging from substantial kingdoms with their own long histories to tiny territories barely larger than a single walled town, and the slow, patient process of the following centuries would see the larger states absorb the smaller ones, year by year, until only a handful of major powers remained. It was during this period that the idea of the hegemon, a powerful regional lord who claimed to act on the Zhou king's behalf while in practice wielding independent authority, first took shape. A succession of ambitious rulers, remembered by Chinese tradition as the 5 hegemons, though the exact list varies between sources, rose one after another to a position of informal leadership over the other states, convening alliance meetings, mediating disputes between smaller territories, and occasionally leading joint military campaigns against nomadic incursions along the frontier, all while carefully maintaining the outward appearance of deference to a Zhou king whose actual power had, by this point, become almost entirely symbolic. Diplomacy during this period had a curiously formal and unhurried quality to it, built around elaborate rituals of hospitality, carefully worded correspondence, and long, patient negotiations conducted through intermediaries who might travel for weeks between courts to deliver a single message. Alliances were sealed with solemn ceremonies involving the sacrifice of an animal and the smearing of its blood on the lips of the participants, a practice meant to bind the parties together as if by kinship, and though these alliances were broken as often as they were kept, the rituals surrounding them reveal a society that valued, at least in its formal self-presentation, order, propriety, and the careful maintenance of appearances even amid shifting political fortunes. It was also during the later years of the Spring and Autumn period that a quiet, somewhat unsuccessful government official from the small state of Lu began traveling from court to court, seeking a ruler willing to put his ideas about virtuous governance into practice. We will spend more time with him shortly, in a chapter of his own, but it is worth pausing here simply to notice the timing. It was precisely amid this long, slow unraveling of centralized Zhou authority, amid all this careful diplomacy and quiet maneuvering between rival courts, that some of the most influential philosophical ideas in Chinese history first began to take shape, born not from stability but from the anxious, searching question of how order might be restored to a fracturing world. It is a strange and gentle paradox worth pausing on tonight. Even as the great territorial states of ancient China fought increasingly organized wars against one another, competing for land, resources, and prestige, this same era of instability produced an extraordinary flourishing of thought, later remembered as the era of the 100 Schools. Traveling scholars moved from court to court, offering rulers advice not on how to win the next battle but on how to govern wisely, how to live rightly, and how to bring order to a world that seemed, on the surface, to be drifting further and further from it. Among these traveling scholars was a quiet, somewhat unsuccessful government official from the state of Lu named Confucius, better known to history by the Latinized name Confucius. Confucius taught a philosophy centered on the cultivation of personal virtue, respect for family and social order, and the belief that a good ruler leads not through fear but through moral example, the way a gentle wind bends the grass simply by moving over it. He did not, in his own lifetime, find the powerful political position he seems to have hoped for, and he died believing himself to have largely failed in his mission, unaware that his recorded conversations, later compiled by his students into the Analects, would go on to shape Chinese ethics, education, and government for the next 2,500 years. Confucius placed enormous patient emphasis on a handful of quiet virtues that could be practiced by anyone, in any station of life, without grand gesture or sudden transformation. Filial devotion toward one's parents, sincerity in one's dealings with others, careful attention to the small rituals of daily courtesy, and a lifelong, unglamorous commitment to self-cultivation through study and reflection. He is remembered as having said that he himself did not fully find his own footing until the age of 30, did not become free of doubt until 40, did not understand the will of heaven until 50, and did not achieve a kind of effortless moral ease until he was 70 years old, a description of gradual, decades-long growth that stands in gentle contrast to any philosophy promising quick or sudden enlightenment. Alongside Confucian thought grew a very different tradition, one associated with a figure remembered as Laozi and the text attributed to him, the Daedaging, which counseled something almost opposite to Confucian effort. A philosophy of quiet non-action, of yielding rather than striving, of aligning oneself with the natural flow of the world, the Tao, rather than attempting to impose order upon it. Where Confucian texts speak of ritual and duty, Taoist texts speak of water, of valleys, of the soft overcoming the hard, and there is something particularly suited to a night like tonight in the old Taoist image of the sage who governs best by doing least, who finds strength not in exertion but in stillness. The Daedaging returns again and again to the image of water as the model for wise living, water that seeks always the lowest place, that offers no resistance and yet, given enough patient time, wears away even the hardest stone, water that nourishes all things without competing with them for glory, water that, poured into any vessel, takes on that vessel's shape without complaint or struggle. To live according to the Tao in this vision is not to strive harder than everyone else but to strive less, to let go of ambition and rigid certainty, and to trust that a soft, yielding approach to life will, in the end, prove more durable than any amount of forceful effort. A second great Taoist text, attributed to a philosopher named Zhuangzi, expressed similar ideas through playful, dreamlike parables rather than terse aphorisms. The story of a man who dreamed he was a butterfly and woke uncertain whether he was a man who had dreamed of being a butterfly or a butterfly now dreaming that he was a man. The story of a cook whose blade, after 19 years of use, remained as sharp as the day it was forged, because he had learned to work with the natural structure. Of the ox he was cutting rather than forcing his way through it. These stories, gentle and unresolved, invite the listener not toward a single firm conclusion but toward a kind of easy, drifting wonder, which feels, again, rather well suited to the hour. A third major tradition, legalism, offered a far more practical and less gentle vision, arguing that human nature could not be trusted to improve through moral example alone and that a strong state needed clear laws, strict enforcement, and centralized authority to function. Legalist thinkers such as Han Fizi argued that rulers should not rely on the slow, uncertain cultivation of virtue among their officials and subjects but should instead establish a fixed, impersonal system of rewards and punishments, applied equally to everyone regardless of rank, so that even a mediocre ruler, simply by enforcing clear laws consistently, could govern as effectively as a sage. Other, smaller schools of thought flourished in this same fertile period as well. The Mahists, followers of a philosopher named Mozi, who preached a doctrine of universal, impartial love for all people rather than the graduated loyalties of Confucian family hierarchy, and who organized themselves into a disciplined community skilled in the defensive engineering of city walls, hired out to help small states resist the aggression of larger ones, and the School of Names, a small group of logicians. Fascinated by paradoxes of language and meaning, debating questions such as whether a white horse could truly be called a horse, playful puzzles that, in their own way, sharpened the philosophical tools later thinkers would use for more practical ends. It was this harder philosophy of legalism, rather than the softer teachings of Confucius, Laozi, or Mozi, that would eventually provide the blueprint for the state that finally brought the long Warring States period to its close, though it is worth remembering, as our own night's journey continues, that all of these competing voices, gentle and harsh alike, continue to echo through Chinese thought for millennia afterward, taking turns at the center of official favor, blending quietly into one another at the edges, never entirely disappearing even when eclipsed. By the early 5th century before our era, the loose network of competing courts that had characterized the spring and autumn period had consolidated into a much smaller number of larger, more centralized, and considerably more dangerous rivals, and it is from this point that historians date the beginning of the Warring States period, a name that describes with plain accuracy the 2 centuries of increasingly organized conflict that followed. 7 major states came to dominate this new landscape. Qin in the rugged west, Chu in the vast south, Qi along the eastern coast, Yan in the far north, and the 3 states of Han, Zhou, and Wei, which had themselves emerged from the earlier breakup of a single large state called Jin. Each of these 7 powers commanded populations in the millions, fielded standing armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and administered its territory through increasingly sophisticated bureaucracies staffed not by hereditary nobles alone but, more and more, by capable commoners selected for administrative or military talent, a slow but significant shift away from the older aristocratic order of the early Zhou. Warfare itself changed considerably during this period, becoming less a matter of aristocratic chariot duels between a small number of noble champions and more a matter of enormous infantry armies, increasingly equipped with iron weapons as ironworking technology slowly spread and improved across the Chinese states. The crossbow, an innovation with a complex trigger mechanism allowing it to be loaded, aimed, and fired with far less individual skill than a traditional bow, gave ordinary infantry soldiers a weapon capable of piercing armor at considerable range, and its gradual adoption across the competing states contributed to the increasingly large scale and increasingly high casualties of Warring States battles. States also began investing heavily in defensive walls, not only around individual cities but along entire frontiers, a practice that would eventually culminate, after unification, in the linking together of these separate frontier walls into the earliest version of what we now call the Great Wall. Irrigation and canal projects, too, expanded dramatically during this period, as states competed not only on the battlefield but in the more patient, less glamorous work of increasing agricultural yield, since a larger and more reliable harvest meant a larger population, a larger tax base, and ultimately a larger army that could be fielded and supplied for longer campaigns. Diplomacy during the Warring States period grew correspondingly more elaborate and more cynical than it had been in earlier centuries. Traveling strategists, sometimes called the School of Diplomacy, made careers out of moving between rival courts, advocating first for one alliance strategy and then, at a different court, for its precise opposite, playing the 7 great powers against one another with an agility that later Chinese historians would remember with a mixture of admiration and moral unease. 2 competing grand strategies dominated the diplomatic thinking of the age. The vertical alliance, which sought to unite the other 6 states against the rising power of Qin, and the horizontal alliance, promoted by strategists in Qin's service, which sought instead to ally with Qin against the other states one at a time, a patient strategy of divide and conquer that would, in the end, prove decisive. Amid all this calculated maneuvering, the philosophical schools born in the earlier spring and autumn period continued to develop and compete for royal patronage, and it was during the Warring States period specifically that Confucian thought found 2 of its most important later interpreters. Mencius, traveling from court to court roughly a century and a half after Confucius's death, argued passionately that human nature was fundamentally good, comparing it to water that naturally flows downward, needing only the right conditions to express its inherent goodness, while a later Confucian thinker named Xuanzi took the opposite position, arguing that human nature tended, without careful education and ritual training, towards selfishness, and that it was the patient, lifelong work of moral cultivation that transformed a person's rough, natural impulses into genuine virtue. By the middle of the 3rd century before our era, after generations of shifting alliances, patient administrative reform, and increasingly decisive military campaigns, one state, Qin, had grown so dominant in territory, population, and military organization that its ultimate victory over its 6 remaining rivals had come, to many contemporary observers, to feel less like a possibility and more like an approaching certainty, the way the coming of winter feels certain to anyone who has watched. The leaves begin, slowly and quietly, to turn. Of the 7 warring states, it was Qin, located in the rugged western territory that had once been the Zhou heartland, that ultimately prevailed, and it did so in large part by embracing legalist philosophy more thoroughly than any of its rivals. Under a series of reforms begun in the 4th century BCE by a statesman named Shang, the state of Qin restructured its society around agricultural productivity and military service, rewarding farmers and soldiers according to strict, measurable standards rather than inherited noble status, and building, over several generations, an army and an administrative machine unlike anything the region had seen before. Shang's reforms, though harsh in their implementation, were remarkably systematic in their design. Land was redistributed and registered under a uniform system that allowed the state to tax and mobilize its population with unprecedented precision. Old aristocratic privileges were curtailed in favor of a rank system based on military achievement, so that a common soldier who distinguished himself in battle could rise, over time, to a position of real status, an opportunity almost unheard of in the more rigidly hereditary societies of the other 6 states. Households were organized into small mutual responsibility groups, whose members were held collectively accountable for one another's conduct, a system that extended the reach of state authority down into the smallest units of everyday village life with a thoroughness that unsettled many contemporaries even as it strengthened Qin's capacity to govern and to fight. The final unification came under a king remembered as Zhang, who ascended the Qin throne as a young boy and, after overcoming a period of court intrigue during his minority, took direct control of the state in his early 20s. Between 230 and 221 BCE, he systematically conquered each of the 6 remaining rival states, one after another, in a sequence of campaigns notable for their careful, unhurried preparation as much as for their eventual speed of execution, until for the first time in its long history, the Chinese heartland stood united under a single ruler. Upon completing this conquest, Zhang took a new title for himself, one that had never existed before and would be used by Chinese rulers for the next 2,000 years. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin. The title combined 2 older words, one associated with legendary rulers of high antiquity and one meaning something like sovereign or lord, and it was chosen, according to later accounts, specifically because Zhang believed his achievement in unifying the realm surpassed that of any ruler who had come before him. A belief that, whatever else may be said about the man, was not entirely without foundation. The reforms that followed unification were sweeping and, in their own methodical way, remarkably calm and orderly, even if the process of imposing them was often harsh. Weights, measures, and currency were standardized across the newly unified territory, replacing the confusing patchwork of different systems that had developed independently in each of the former warring states. The width of cart axles was fixed by law so that roads could be built and used uniformly across the empire, allowing wheeled vehicles to move smoothly along the ruts of the new imperial road network regardless of which region they had originated in. Regional scripts, which had drifted apart during the centuries of division, were unified into a single standardized writing system, an achievement whose consequences we can still read today, since it is largely because of this standardization that speakers of mutually unintelligible Chinese dialects have, for over 2,000 years, been able to read the very same written characters. Qin Shi Huang also began the enormous project of connecting and extending earlier defensive walls along the empire's northern frontier into a single continuous barrier against nomadic incursions, the earliest ancestor of what would later become known as the Great Wall of China, though the wall visitors picture today was largely rebuilt many centuries later, under the Ming dynasty. The labor required for this project, along with the construction of a vast network of imperial roads and canals, was drawn from hundreds of thousands of conscripted laborers, many of whom traveled great distances from their home villages to work for months or years at a time under difficult and often dangerous conditions, a burden that later historians would identify as one of the central sources of popular resentment against the new dynasty. And in preparation for his own death, the first emperor ordered the construction of an enormous underground mausoleum near his capital, guarded by an army of several thousand life-size terracotta soldiers, each one individually crafted with slightly different facial features, standing in silent formation underground for more than 2,000 years before their rediscovery by farmers digging a well in 1974. The scale of the mausoleum complex, which according to ancient descriptions included rivers of flowing mercury and a ceiling inlaid with pearls to represent the stars, reflects both the enormous resources commanded by the unified empire and the deeply personal anxiety of a ruler who, having achieved more in his own lifetime than any predecessor, seems to have spent his final years searching with increasing desperation for some means of avoiding death altogether, sending expeditions in search of legendary elixirs of immortality that, unsurprisingly, never materialized. For all its administrative achievement, the Qin dynasty itself proved remarkably short-lived. Its legalist methods, so effective at winning wars and imposing order, relied heavily on harsh punishments and enormous forced labor projects that placed a tremendous burden on the common population. And when Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE while traveling on an inspection tour of the eastern provinces, the dynasty he had built at such cost began to unravel almost immediately. His death was concealed for weeks by court officials anxious to manage the succession, the imperial carriage reportedly accompanied by carts of salted fish to disguise the smell of the emperor's decomposing body during the long, slow journey back to the capital, a strange and quietly unsettling detail that later historians recorded with evident fascination. Rebellions broke out across the former warring states almost as soon as the news of the emperor's death became known, led first by a group of conscripted laborers who, delayed by heavy rains and facing certain execution under Qin law for their lateness, reasoned that they had nothing left to lose by rebelling instead, and then by a widening circle of former nobles and ambitious commoners alike. Within just 4 years, by 206 BCE, the Qin dynasty had collapsed entirely, leaving behind not a lasting ruling house but something arguably more important: the enduring template of a unified Chinese empire, which the next dynasty would inherit and, this time, sustain for 4 centuries. Out of the chaos following the Qin collapse rose a former minor official of peasant origin named Liu Bang, who, after several years of civil war against a rival claimant named Shang, a proud aristocratic general who won nearly every battle between them yet somehow lost the war, established himself as emperor in 202 BCE and founded the Han dynasty, a ruling house so long-lasting and so culturally influential that the majority ethnic group of China still refers to itself, to this day, as the Han people. The contrast between Liu Bang and Xiang, as later historians told it, offered its own quiet lesson in the patient virtues we have returned to again and again tonight. Xiang was, by every contemporary account, the more naturally gifted commander, brave to the point of recklessness, capable of inspiring fierce personal loyalty among his soldiers, and yet also proud, quick to anger, and unwilling to share credit or reward with the capable subordinates around him. Liu Bang, by contrast, was an unremarkable soldier and an unremarkable administrator in his own right, but he possessed, according to tradition, an unusual talent for recognizing talent in others and a willingness to delegate real authority to skilled generals and advisors, so that the eventual Han victory was less the story of one extraordinary man than of one ordinary man wise enough to gather extraordinary help around him. The early Han rulers learned a quiet but important lesson from the sudden collapse of the Qin: that an empire built purely on harsh legalist discipline could win unification but could not easily keep it. The Han therefore softened many of the Qin's stricter policies, drew more heavily on Confucian ideals of benevolent governance, and allowed a period of recovery and gradual economic growth, during which the population of the unified Chinese heartland is estimated to have grown to somewhere between 50 and 60 million people, an extraordinary figure for the ancient world, comparable to the population of the Roman Empire at its height on the opposite end of the Eurasian landmass. The very earliest Han emperors, mindful of how exhausted the population had become after the endless conscription and warfare of the late Qin and the civil war that followed it, deliberately pursued a policy of quiet restraint, sometimes described by the Taoist phrase wu wei, or non-action, lowering taxes, reducing the scale of state-building projects, and allowing local communities a considerable degree of undisturbed self-governance, trusting, in a manner not unlike the old Taoist philosophy, of yielding rather than striving, that a tired and depleted population would recover its strength more quickly if simply left alone to do so. Under Emperor Wu, who ruled for more than 50 years beginning in 141 BCE, the Han dynasty reached its greatest territorial extent, pushing its borders deep into Central Asia, establishing garrisons and diplomatic missions along routes that would come to be known collectively as the Silk Road, a network of caravan paths along which Chinese silk moved slowly westward toward Persia, India, and eventually the Roman world, while wool, glass, horses, and new crops moved slowly eastward in return. This exchange was never fast and never dramatic, more a matter of caravans creeping across enormous distances, month after month, than of sudden discovery, and there is something fitting in imagining those long, patient camel trains moving across the desert under a wide and quiet sky. The opening of these westward routes owed a great deal to the extraordinary decade-spanning journey of an envoy named Zhang, who was dispatched by Emperor Wu around 138 BCE to seek an alliance with distant peoples against a shared nomadic rival, only to be captured and held for roughly 10 years by the very nomadic confederation he had been sent to bypass. Zhang eventually escaped, continued westward into territories no Han official had ever visited, and after further years of travel and a second period of captivity on his return journey, finally made his way back to the Han court more than a decade after his departure, bringing with him the first reliable Chinese accounts of the kingdoms of Central Asia, information that would quietly reshape Han foreign policy and trade for generations to come. It was also under the Han that Confucianism, once merely one philosophy among the 100 schools, was formally adopted as the guiding ideology of the state, and an imperial academy was established to train officials in the Confucian classics, laying the groundwork for the examination-based civil service system that would, in later centuries, become one of the defining features of Chinese government for nearly 2,000 years. Young men from families of modest means, though rarely the very poorest, could in principle rise to positions of real influence within the imperial bureaucracy through demonstrated mastery of the Confucian classics, a meritocratic ideal that, however imperfectly realized in practice, distinguished Han government from many of its contemporaries elsewhere in the ancient world. Paper, one of the most quietly transformative inventions in human history, was developed during the Han period as well, gradually replacing the heavier bamboo strips and expensive silk that had previously been used for writing. Traditional accounts credit a court official named Kai Luan with perfecting the manufacturing process around 105 CE, using a pulp made from mulberry bark, hemp fibers, old rags, and fishing nets, pressed thin and dried on a flat screen, a technique whose basic outline remains recognizable in papermaking to this day, and whose slow spread westward, over the following centuries, would eventually transform the way information moved across the entire Eurasian continent. The Han dynasty did not proceed in a single unbroken line. Around 9 CE, a court official named Wang Mang briefly usurped the throne and attempted a program of sweeping reforms before being overthrown some 15 years later, after which the Han was restored under what historians call the Later or Eastern Han, ruling from a new capital at Luoyang for nearly 2 more centuries. Wang Mang's short-lived Xian dynasty, though ultimately unsuccessful, attempted a remarkably ambitious set of land redistribution and currency reforms, inspired by an idealized reading of ancient Zhou institutions, and its failure, brought on by administrative overreach, natural disaster, and widespread popular unrest, offered later generations a cautionary lesson about the dangers of reforming too quickly, too completely, and without sufficient regard for the slow, patient pace at which ordinary people are able to absorb change. But by the late 2nd century CE, weakened by court intrigue, natural disasters, and a series of large peasant uprisings including the Yellow Turban Rebellion, whose followers wore yellow cloth around their heads and drew on a millenarian strand of religious Taoism promising the imminent arrival of a new age of great peace, the Han dynasty's authority slowly dissolved into regional warlordism, and in 220 CE the last Han emperor formally abdicated, closing a chapter that had, in one form or another, lasted for more than 400 years. Before we turn toward the closing of our long night's journey, let us pause for a while longer over one particular thread of the Han story, not a battle or a succession crisis but something slower and quieter. The daily, patient rhythm of life along the trade routes that Zhang Qian's long journey had helped to open. It is easy, when telling the history of an empire, to speak only of emperors and generals, and to forget the much larger number of ordinary people whose small, repeated labors actually carried a civilization forward, one season at a time. A caravan setting out from the Han frontier city of Dunhuang toward the west might travel for weeks through some of the most unforgiving terrain on the entire continent, threading a careful path along the edges of vast deserts, resting at a chain of oasis towns whose wells and orchards had been sustaining travelers for as long as anyone could remember. Camels, better suited than horses to the extremes of desert heat and cold, carried the bulk of the cargo, their slow, steady, rolling gait setting the pace for the entire journey, a pace that could not be hurried no matter how valuable the silk bundled carefully in the packs on their backs. The merchants who undertook these journeys were rarely, in the earliest centuries of the trade, Chinese merchants traveling the entire distance themselves. More often, goods passed through a long relay of intermediaries, Central Asian, Persian, and eventually Roman traders, each handling only a portion of the total distance, buying and reselling silk, spices, and other goods at each stage along the way, so that by the time a bolt of Chinese silk reached a wealthy household in Rome, it had likely passed through the hands of a dozen different merchants across a dozen different cultures, each adding their own small margin of profit, each knowing only a fragment of the enormous distance the silk had already traveled and had yet to travel still. Along the route, oasis towns grew wealthy and cosmopolitan, home to communities of merchants and travelers from a startling range of distant homelands, their marketplaces filled with a correspondingly wide range of languages, foods, and goods. Chinese silk and lacquerware moving west. Central Asian horses, prized by the Han court for their strength and endurance, moving east. Glassware and coral from the distant Mediterranean. Grapes, alfalfa, and eventually the seeds of new crops that would gradually enrich Chinese agriculture over the following centuries. Buddhist monks, too, traveled these same slow caravan routes from India and Central Asia, carrying with them scriptures and teachings that would, over the following several centuries, take root across China and eventually reshape its religious landscape as profoundly as any change since the introduction of Confucian orthodoxy under Emperor Wu. Back within the Chinese heartland itself, away from the drama of distant trade routes, the greater part of the Han population continued to live much as their Zhou and Shang ancestors had, in small farming villages governed by the same patient agricultural calendar we have already described. Fields plowed in spring, tended through the long heat of summer, harvested in autumn, and rested through the cold of winter, while silk production, an activity carried out almost entirely by women within the household, added its own quiet seasonal rhythm alongside the grain harvest. Raising silkworms required extraordinary patience and attention to detail. The tiny worms had to be fed fresh mulberry leaves several times a day as they grew, kept at a steady, carefully regulated temperature, and protected from any sudden disturbance, since silkworms were believed, not entirely without reason, to be sensitive to loud noises and strong smells. After several weeks of steady feeding, each worm would spin a single, continuous thread of silk around itself to form a cocoon, and it was the careful, delicate work of unwinding that single thread, sometimes stretching for close to a mile if unwound without breaking, that produced the raw material for the fabric that would eventually travel all the way to Rome, carried by camel and by ship, valued there, according to later Roman writers, at nearly its weight in gold. It is worth resting for a moment on the sheer scale of patience embedded in this one small industry. Months of careful daily attention from a single household, repeated across thousands upon thousands of households throughout the empire, in order to produce enough silk to sustain a trade network spanning half the known world. There is a lesson in that quiet, cumulative patience that feels entirely appropriate to carry with you as our own night's journey continues gently toward its close. Running beneath every dynasty we have visited tonight, beneath the oracle bones of the Shang and the philosophical debates of the warring states and the vast trade networks of the Han, there flowed a quieter, more constant current. The deep and abiding importance of family, ancestry, and household ritual in the daily lives of ordinary people across almost the entire span of ancient Chinese history. The veneration of ancestors was not, in ancient China, a matter of occasional or symbolic remembrance but an active, ongoing relationship, understood by most people to continue meaningfully beyond death. A family's deceased parents and grandparents were believed to retain an interest in the fortunes of their living descendants, capable of extending protection and blessing when properly honored, and capable, if neglected, of bringing misfortune upon the household through their displeasure, much as the Shang kings had once consulted the oracle bones to determine whether a particular royal ancestor required additional offerings. Within even a modest household, a small shrine or set of ancestral tablets, each inscribed with the name of a deceased family member, occupied a place of quiet honor, and it was there that the living members of the family would offer food, wine, and incense at regular intervals throughout the year, particularly around the turning of the seasons, informing their ancestors of significant family events, seeking their guidance before important decisions, and generally maintaining the sense of an unbroken, continuous household stretching backward through the generations and, it was hoped, forward through the generations yet to come. This deep attachment to ancestry and lineage helps explain, in turn, why Confucian teaching placed such extraordinary emphasis on filial devotion, the respectful, attentive care of children toward their living parents, as the foundational virtue from which all other social virtues were understood to grow. A person who could not be trusted to honor and care for their own parents, the reasoning went, could hardly be trusted to serve a ruler faithfully or to deal honestly with friends and neighbors, and so the household, however humble, came to be understood as the essential training ground for the broader social order, the small unit from which the larger harmony of the state was ultimately built, one generation, one family, one quiet daily act of respect at a time. The rituals surrounding marriage, too, moved at their own unhurried, carefully staged pace throughout most of ancient Chinese history, involving a lengthy sequence of formal steps. The sending of a matchmaker to propose the match, the careful exchange of the prospective bride and groom's birth details to be checked for astrological compatibility, the formal presentation of betrothal gifts, and finally, often months or even years after the initial proposal, the wedding ceremony itself, during which the bride would be escorted, usually at night by torchlight, in a slow procession from her parents' household to her new home, a journey often covered with a red veil, red being considered from very early times an auspicious color associated with good fortune and vitality. Funerals, too, followed elaborate and carefully prescribed customs, particularly among the wealthy, whose tombs, like the extraordinary underground army of Qin Shi Huang or the jade-encased burial suits found in some Han royal tombs, were built and furnished with the belief that a comfortable and well-provisioned afterlife awaited the deceased, not so different, in its essential concerns, from the comfortable and well-provisioned life they had led while still among the living. Even far more modest households, unable to afford elaborate tomb goods, observed careful mourning periods, wore simple, undyed clothing to signal their grief, and refrained from ordinary festivities for a prescribed span of months, sometimes years, depending on their relationship to the deceased, a slow and structured process of collective mourning that gave grief itself a patient, orderly shape rather than leaving it to unfold without guidance. It is this quiet, steady undercurrent of family ritual and ancestral memory, perhaps even more than the more dramatic events of conquest and philosophy we have already traced tonight, that gives ancient Chinese civilization its particular, enduring texture. The sense of countless individual households, each tending its own small shrine, each honoring its own particular ancestors, each planting and harvesting according to the same patient seasonal calendar, together forming, almost without anyone fully intending it, the vast and continuous civilization whose long story we have been slowly walking through tonight. Let us slow down once more before we finally close, and spend a little time simply walking, in our imagination, through the streets of a large Han city, not to witness any particular event but simply to notice the unremarkable, comfortable texture of everyday urban life almost 2,000 years ago, a texture that, in its broad outlines, would feel oddly familiar to anyone who has ever wandered through a crowded market on an ordinary afternoon. The Han capital of Chang'an, in its later years, is thought to have housed several 100,000 residents within its walls, making it, at the time, one of the largest cities anywhere on Earth, comparable in scale to imperial Rome itself. The city was laid out with a careful, deliberate geometry, its streets running in straight lines according to a grid, its walls pierced by great gates aligned to the cardinal directions, its palace complexes and government offices occupying their own separate, walled precincts, set apart from the noisier, more crowded residential and commercial quarters where the majority of the population actually lived and worked. Within the designated market districts, strictly regulated by government officials who opened and closed the gates at fixed hours each day, a bewildering variety of goods changed hands. Grain and vegetables brought in each morning from the surrounding countryside, bolts of silk and hemp cloth, iron tools and cooking vessels, salt, a state monopoly whose trade was carefully controlled and taxed, lacquerware, decorated with the same slow, careful patience that had once gone into Shang bronze, casting centuries before, and brought all the way from the western reaches of the empire and beyond, small quantities of exotic goods, glass beads, unusual spices, and occasionally, for the very wealthy, a length of imported wool or a piece of Central Asian jewelry, tangible evidence of just how far the quiet caravans of the Silk Road actually reached. Craftsmen in these cities organized themselves, informally at first and later with more official recognition, into groups according to their trade, passing skills down from master to apprentice across years of careful, patient training, much as the Shang bronze casters had done many centuries earlier. A young apprentice might spend years simply preparing materials and observing before being trusted with more delicate work, a slow apprenticeship that mirrored, in its own way, the slow, patient cultivation of virtue that Confucian teaching prescribed for moral development, as though the ancient Chinese understanding of skill and the ancient Chinese understanding of character shared a common, unhurried logic. that anything worth doing well simply could not be rushed. Beyond the walls of the great cities, the far larger rural population continued to organize its life according to units of local administration that reached, in careful layers, all the way down from the emperor's court to the smallest village. Provinces divided into commanderies, commanderies divided into counties, counties divided further into townships and, at the very base of this long administrative chain, into small groups of neighboring households held collectively responsible for reporting births, deaths, and any disturbances to the local authorities, an echo of the same mutual responsibility system Shang had introduced in Qin centuries before, now softened and absorbed into the ordinary rhythm of Han rural life. Local officials, appointed from the capital and expected to serve away from their own home regions in order to discourage the kind of local favoritism that might undermine impartial governance, were responsible for an enormous range of quiet, unglamorous administrative tasks. Maintaining local roads and granaries, adjudicating minor disputes between neighbors, overseeing the collection of taxes in grain or labor service, and reporting, at regular and carefully prescribed intervals, on conditions within their district to their superiors further up the long chain of command, so that even in a territory as vast as the Han Empire, the movements of information, however slowly, connected the smallest village to the emperor's own court. It is worth imagining for a moment the sheer scale of quiet, patient labor the system required. Thousands upon thousands of local officials, scribes, and clerks, most of them entirely unknown to history, filing reports, maintaining records, settling small disputes, and keeping the enormous machinery of empire turning smoothly, one unremarkable day at a time, for century after century. It is this vast, largely invisible labor, far more than the more dramatic deeds of emperors and generals, that actually held so ancient and so enormous a civilization together, and it deserves, on a night like tonight, at least this brief, quiet moment of recognition before we let it, too, fade gently from view. We have spoken tonight again and again of a single unfolding story, dynasty following dynasty in a long, patient line, and there is truth in telling it that way. But it is worth pausing here before we continue to remember that the land itself was never quite so simple or so unified as that neat sequence of names might suggest, and that ancient China, across the many centuries we have wandered through tonight, was in truth a vast patchwork of very different landscapes, climates, and ways of life, all gradually, unevenly, and never entirely completely drawn together under the same widening umbrella of dynastic rule. To the north and west, along the frontier where the settled farming world gave way to open grassland, lived pastoral nomadic peoples whose entire way of life, built around herds of horses, sheep, and cattle moved seasonally across vast distances, stood in quiet, permanent contrast to the fixed fields and rooted villages of the Chinese heartland. These frontier peoples, sometimes trading peacefully with Chinese border towns, sometimes raiding them, sometimes allying with one Chinese state against another during the long centuries of division, were never fully absorbed into the settled agricultural world, and the long, uneasy, endlessly negotiated relationship between the farming valleys and the grassland frontier forms its own quiet undercurrent beneath almost every dynasty we have discussed tonight, visible in every wall built, every garrison established, every marriage alliance arranged between a Chinese princess and a distant nomadic chieftain. To the deep south, beyond the Yangtze and further still toward the tropical river deltas that would only slowly, over many centuries, come fully within the reach of northern dynasties, an entirely different world of hills, forests, and wet rice terraces supported its own distinct populations, speaking their own languages, following their own customs, only gradually drawn into the cultural and administrative orbit of the northern courts as Qin and Han armies, and later dynasties still pushed further and further southward in a slow, patient process of settlement and assimilation that would continue for well over 1,000 years. Even within what we might loosely call the Chinese heartland itself, the world of the dry, wheat and millet-growing north felt, to anyone who traveled between them, quite distinct from the wetter, rice-growing world of the central and southern river valleys. Northern cuisine, built around wheat noodles, steamed bread, and hearty millet porridge, differed in almost every particular from the rice-centered diet of the South, and the spoken dialects of the two regions, though sharing the same underlying written script once that script had been standardized under the Qin, could differ enough that a northern official posted to a southern province might find the local speech almost entirely unintelligible on first arrival. Mountains, too, shaped this patchwork landscape as decisively as rivers did, carving the land into a series of semi-isolated basins and valleys, each with its own particular blend of soil and climate, each capable, for long stretches of history, of supporting a largely self-sufficient regional economy even when central authority weakened or fractured entirely, as it so often did during the long transitions between one dynasty and the next. It was this underlying geographic diversity, as much as any single emperor's ambition, that made the recurring project of unification, first under the Qin and then reaffirmed under the Han, feel like such a genuinely difficult and hard-won achievement rather than a simple, inevitable outcome. And yet, for all this underlying diversity, something did gradually, patiently draw these many different regions into a shared civilization across the centuries we have traced tonight. A common written script that could be read, if not spoken aloud in the same way, from the northern plains to the southern river deltas. A shared reverence for ancestors and a shared calendar of seasonal ritual. And, slowly accumulating with each successive dynasty, a shared historical memory, passed down through court chronicles and popular story alike, of Yu taming the flood, of the Duke of Zhou governing with restraint, of Confucius wandering from court to court in search of a ruler willing to listen. It is this shared memory, more than any single unbroken political authority, that gives ancient China, for all its internal variety, the quiet, continuous shape of a single long story. Among all the quiet inheritances that ancient China left to the centuries that followed, few are as remarkable, or as strangely comforting to consider on a night like tonight, as the slow, patient evolution of Chinese writing itself, a system of marks that began, so far as we can tell, as small scratches on bone and grew, over more than 3,000 years of gradual refinement, into one of the most enduring and most widely used writing systems in the entire history of the world. The earliest recognizable ancestors of Chinese characters are those oracle bone inscriptions we visited earlier tonight, carved by Shang diviners into turtle shell and ox bone, angular and pictographic in form, so that a character for sun might resemble an actual small circle with a dot at its center. A character for mountain might resemble three simple peaks rising from a baseline. A character for a person might resemble the simple curved outline of someone standing in quiet profile. Even at this earliest stage, however, the script was already far more than simple picture writing. Many characters combined a meaning element with a sound element, a technique that would allow the writing system to represent abstract ideas and grammatical relationships that no simple picture could ever fully capture on its own. As the centuries passed from Shang to Zhou, the script gradually grew more standardized and more elegant, cast now into bronze ritual vessels in long, careful inscriptions that recorded royal grants of land, military victories, and solemn oaths of loyalty, the characters themselves growing rounder and more balanced in form than the sharp, angular scratches of the earlier oracle bones. It was during the long centuries of the Warring States period, however, that the script grew most fractured, each of the 7 rival states gradually developing its own slightly different regional variations, so that a document written in the state of Chu might already look subtly, sometimes significantly, different from the same words written in the state of Qin, a divergence that, left unchecked, might eventually have split Chinese writing into several entirely separate systems. It was this fracturing, precisely, that Qin Shi Huang's famous standardization of script sought to reverse, and the version of the writing system his officials imposed across the newly unified empire, refined further under the following Han dynasty into a clear, regular, brush-written style called clerical script, became the shared foundation from which nearly all later Chinese writing would grow. The particular genius of this standardization, worth resting on again for a moment, is that it fixed the written form of the language while leaving spoken pronunciation free to drift, region by region, exactly as it always had, so that speakers of quite different dialects, unable perhaps to understand a single word of one another's spoken conversation, could nonetheless read the very same written page with perfect, shared understanding. The physical materials of writing evolved alongside the script itself, at their own equally unhurried pace. Before the Han-era refinement of paper we discussed earlier tonight, texts were typically inscribed with a brush and ink onto long, narrow strips of bamboo or wood, bound together at the edges with cord into rolled bundles not unlike a slatted window blind, so that a single lengthy text might require dozens or even hundreds of individual strips, heavy and cumbersome to transport, requiring real physical effort simply to carry a modest library from one place to another. Silk, lighter and smoother, offered a more elegant alternative for especially important documents, but its considerable expense kept it well out of reach for the ordinary, everyday recording of government business, until the slow, patient development of paper finally offered something lighter, cheaper, and, in time, nearly universal. Calligraphy itself, The disciplined, unhurried art of forming these characters with brush and ink came to be regarded, especially among the educated elite of later centuries, as one of the highest and most personally revealing of all art forms, a discipline requiring years of careful, repetitive practice before a student's hand could produce characters with the right balance of strength and softness, the right controlled flow of ink from a fully loaded brush. There is something quietly fitting in the fact that a civilization so devoted, in its philosophy and its daily ritual alike, to patience and gradual cultivation should also have produced a writing system whose mastery demanded exactly that same slow, repeated, lifelong practice, stroke by careful stroke, for as long as a person continued to hold the brush. Let us turn now, gently, toward one of the quietest and most universal threads running beneath every century we have visited tonight. The simple, daily question of what people actually ate, a question that connects the humblest Yangshao farmer to the grandest Han emperor in a way that dynasties and philosophies, for all their importance, sometimes obscure. In the earliest river villages, diet followed geography closely, as we have already noted, millet and later wheat, forming the foundation of the northern table, while rice anchored meals throughout the warmer, wetter south. These staple grains were typically prepared as a thick, warming porridge, simmered slowly over a low fire for a considerable length of time, a preparation method that made even a modest quantity of grain stretch to feed an entire family, and that remains, in gently varied forms, a comforting and common breakfast across China to this very day. Vegetables gathered from garden plots close to the home supplemented this grain-based foundation. Cabbage, gourds, various leafy greens, and, from a relatively early date, soybeans, whose remarkable nutritional value the ancient Chinese seem to have recognized and made use of long before Europeans encountered the plant at all. Meat, by contrast, appeared on the ordinary table only occasionally, reserved more often for ritual offerings to ancestors or for special festival occasions than for regular daily consumption, with pork, favored in the settled agricultural regions where pigs could be raised efficiently on household scraps, gradually emerging as the most common meat of celebration across much of the Chinese heartland. The Shang and Zhou courts, unsurprisingly, enjoyed a far richer and more varied table than ordinary villagers, and the archaeological record, alongside surviving ritual texts, describes elaborate banquets involving carefully prepared meats, seasoned broths, and a range of fermented beverages brewed from grain, served in precisely those same bronze ritual vessels we admired earlier tonight, each vessel shaped for a particular type of food or drink, arranged with careful formality according to rules of rank and precedence that governed nearly every aspect of court life. By the Han Dynasty, culinary technique and variety had expanded considerably, aided by improved ironware that made cooking vessels lighter, more durable, and better able to conduct heat evenly than the older bronze and ceramic pots of earlier centuries. Stir-frying in a small amount of hot oil, a technique that allowed food to be cooked quickly over a strong flame while conserving precious fuel, seems to have developed gradually during this period, alongside a growing repertoire of preserved and fermented foods, pickled vegetables, salted fish, and fermented soybean pastes, all developed as patient, practical solutions to the perennial challenge of keeping food edible through the long months between one harvest and the next. The opening of the Silk Road, which we visited a little earlier tonight, gradually introduced new ingredients into this already rich culinary tradition as well. Grapes, walnuts, sesame, and a variety of new spices arrived slowly, over generations, carried by the same patient camel caravans that carried silk in the opposite direction. Each new ingredient absorbed gradually into Chinese cuisine at its own unhurried pace, tested and adapted by generations of cooks until it became, eventually, simply another familiar part of the ordinary table, its foreign origins nearly forgotten. There is something quietly grounding in remembering, at this hour, that beneath every emperor and every philosopher we have discussed tonight, there was, every single day, the same simple and repeated human task of preparing a meal, grain washed and set to simmer, vegetables gathered and chopped, a fire tended carefully to the right, steady heat, the same unhurried, necessary labor performed in millions of separate households, across thousands of years, long before any of it was written down, and long after most of the names of the people who performed it were quietly, gently forgotten. If we allow ourselves for a little while longer to drift through the sensory texture of ancient Chinese life rather than its politics, we might pause next on sound, and in particular on the careful, ceremonial music that accompanied so much of ancient Chinese ritual life, from the grandest royal sacrifice down to the quiet, private ceremonies of an ordinary household. Music in ancient China was never considered a matter of mere entertainment, but rather, especially within Confucian thought, a serious instrument of moral and political order, believed capable of harmonizing not only the emotions of individual listeners but the broader relationships between ruler and subject, parent and child, heaven and the human world below it. Confucius himself is remembered as having been deeply moved by a particular piece of ancient ceremonial music, so absorbed in its beauty, according to one famous anecdote, that he reportedly did not notice the taste of meat for 3 full months afterward, so thoroughly had the experience occupied his attention. Bronze bells, cast with the same painstaking multi-stage technique used for Shang and Zhou ritual vessels, formed one of the most important instrument families of the ancient Chinese court orchestra, and an extraordinary set of 65 such bells, recovered undisturbed from the 5th century BCE tomb of a minor ruler named Yi of Zhang, remains capable, even today, of producing 2 distinct musical tones from a single bell depending on where it is struck, a level of acoustic precision that required extraordinarily sophisticated bronze casting knowledge, passed down and refined across many patient generations of craftsmen whose names, like so many others in this story, have not survived. Alongside bells, ancient Chinese court orchestras employed stone chimes, tuned by careful, gradual grinding to produce precise pitches. Various forms of drums, marking rhythm and signaling ceremonial transitions, and a range of string and wind instruments, including the guqin, a 7-string zither whose quiet, resonant tones were considered especially suited to solitary reflection, cultivated by scholars and gentlemen as an accompaniment to private contemplation rather than public performance. Its slow, deliberate melodies intended less to impress an audience than to calm and steady the mind of the player alone in a quiet room. Ritual music of the Zhou court was organized according to an elaborate and carefully graduated system reflecting the rank of whoever commissioned it, the number of musicians permitted, the number of bell rows displayed, and the particular ceremonial pieces performed were all fixed, quite precisely, according to whether the occasion involved the Zhou king himself, a regional lord, or a lesser noble, so that music itself became, in its own quiet way, a visible and audible expression of the same careful social hierarchy that governed nearly every other aspect of court life. Even as dynasties rose and fell across the centuries we have traced tonight, this deep association between music, ritual, and moral order persisted with remarkable consistency, each new dynasty typically taking care, in its opening years, to establish or restore proper ceremonial music alongside its more obviously political reforms, on the theory, inherited quietly across generations, that a realm whose court music had fallen out of harmony was a realm whose broader moral and political order stood likewise at risk of falling out of harmony, an idea that asks us, even tonight, to imagine sound itself as a kind of quiet, careful architecture, holding an entire civilization gently in tune. There is perhaps no activity better suited to the mood of tonight's long, slow journey than the equally slow, equally patient work of ancient Chinese astronomy, a discipline pursued across every dynasty we have visited so far, not out of idle curiosity but out of a deeply held conviction that the movements of the heavens and the fortunes of the human world below were intimately, inseparably connected. Chinese court astronomers, whose office can be traced back with reasonable confidence to the Shang dynasty and its careful oracle bone divinations, maintained records of celestial events with a diligence and continuity that modern historians and astronomers alike have come to treasure. Eclipses of the sun and moon, the appearance of comets, and the sudden brightening of what we now understand to be exploding stars were all recorded year after year, dynasty after dynasty, producing what is today recognized as one of the longest continuous astronomical records kept by any civilization in human history, a patient accumulation of careful nightly observation stretching back, in some form, well over 3,000 years. These observations were never merely academic. Because the ruling dynasty's legitimacy rested, as we discussed earlier tonight, on the mandate of heaven, unusual celestial events were widely interpreted as meaningful signs, an eclipse or a comet potentially signaling heaven's displeasure with the current ruler, and court astronomers accordingly bore a heavy, sometimes politically dangerous responsibility for interpreting these signs correctly and reporting them honestly to the emperor, a task requiring not only careful technical observation, but considerable personal courage, since an unwelcome interpretation, however accurate, was not always warmly received at court. Alongside this careful watching of unusual events, ancient Chinese astronomers devoted enormous patient effort to the more routine, unglamorous work of calendar making, a task of real practical importance for an agricultural civilization whose entire rhythm of life, as we have seen again and again tonight, depended on knowing precisely when to plant, when to expect the flooding of a river, and when to prepare for the return of winter. The Chinese calendar combined a lunar count of months with periodic adjustments to keep pace with the solar year, a system requiring careful, ongoing observation and calculation to prevent the calendar from gradually drifting out of alignment with the actual turning of the seasons. Exactly the kind of slow, patient, repeated labor that is run beneath so much of tonight's story. The invention of instruments to aid this careful sky watching kept pace with the growing sophistication of the observations themselves. Gnomons, simple vertical rods whose shadow length at noon could be measured to determine the solstices and equinoxes with real precision. Armillary spheres, nested rings of bronze representing the celestial equator and other key astronomical circles, allowing observers to track the position of celestial bodies with increasing accuracy across the centuries. And, developed during the Han Dynasty by the polymath scholar Zhang, an early seismoscope capable of detecting the direction of a distant earthquake through the fall of a small bronze ball from the mouth of one of 8 dragon figures arranged around the device, a quiet, elegant piece of engineering that would not be matched in sensitivity by any device elsewhere in the world for many centuries afterward. There is something particularly soothing, on a night devoted to slow rest, in picturing these ancient astronomers at their nightly work, seated quietly on a high platform beneath the enormous, star-filled dome of the sky, patiently recording the slow wheel of the constellations overhead, night after night, year after year, across a span of centuries so long that individual astronomers came and went, generation succeeding generation, while the careful, continuous record itself simply continued, unhurried, exactly as the stars themselves continued turning slowly overhead, indifferent to any single human lifetime, then as now. We have touched, at various points tonight, on individual women whose lives left a clear mark on the historical record. Fu Hao, the Shang consort who led armies into battle. The anonymous Zhou wife awaiting her husband's return from military service, remembered only through the quiet lines of an old poem. Before we let our story finally settle toward its close, it is worth gathering these scattered threads together for a little while, and considering more directly the broader shape of women's lives across the many centuries we have traveled through tonight. Within the ordinary agricultural household that formed the foundation of Chinese society across every dynasty we have discussed, the labor of women was every bit as essential, and every bit as demanding as the labor of men, even if the particular tasks assigned to each were usually kept carefully, traditionally distinct. Where men were typically responsible for plowing and the heavier seasonal fieldwork, women commonly managed the equally demanding, equally continuous work of the household itself: food preparation, the raising of young children, the tending of household gardens and small livestock, and, as we discussed earlier tonight, the long, painstaking labor of silk production, from the daily feeding of silkworms through the careful spinning and weaving of the finished thread into cloth. Confucian teaching, as it developed and eventually gained official favor from the Han Dynasty onward, articulated a fairly clear and fairly restrictive vision of appropriate female virtue, centered on obedience, first to one's father, then to one's husband, and in widowhood to one's grown son, alongside careful modesty and unwavering devotion to the well-being of the household. It is important to say plainly, even at this quiet hour, that this was a real and often limiting framework, one that closed off many forms of public authority and independent action that were more freely available to men of the same social class. And yet the historical record, examined patiently rather than through the lens of official doctrine alone, reveals a picture considerably more varied than these formal teachings alone might suggest. We have already met Fu Hao, whose Shang-era tomb reveals a woman entrusted with real military command. The Han Dynasty, for its part, produced Ban Zhao, a woman of exceptional learning who completed the historical writings left unfinished at her brother's death, served as a tutor to the imperial court, and wrote her own influential treatise on female education and conduct, a text that, whatever its ultimately conservative message, stands as clear evidence that women of sufficient education and family standing could and did participate directly in the intellectual life of the Han court. Widowhood, too, carried its own complicated texture across these centuries. While remarriage was generally discouraged, particularly among elite families concerned with the moral reputation of their household, it was neither unknown nor universally forbidden across the entire span of ancient Chinese history, and widows of sufficient means, freed in a sense from the direct authority of a living husband, sometimes exercised real, practical control over household property and the raising of their children, their formal legal standing more constrained than a man's. There Actual daily authority within the household often considerably broader than the formal texts alone would suggest. It is worth closing this quiet chapter, as with so much of tonight's journey, not with a single tidy conclusion but with an acknowledgement of complexity held gently, without urgency, that the lives of ancient Chinese women, like the lives of ordinary farmers and craftsmen we have also considered tonight, were shaped by real and often narrowing constraints, and also, within those constraints, filled with the same daily labor, skill, resilience, and quiet endurance that carried this entire long civilization forward, one patient, unrecorded day at a time, across so many centuries that we can now only begin, gently, to imagine. We have spoken, at various points tonight, of battles and unifications and the sweeping movements of armies across the map of ancient China, but we have not yet paused, as we are about to now, on the far quieter and far more ordinary experience of the individual soldier whose long marches and long waits, far more than any single dramatic battle, actually filled the greater part of ancient Chinese military life. For most of the period we have traveled through tonight, military service was not a specialized, lifelong profession but a periodic obligation woven into the ordinary rhythm of agricultural life, a duty owed by most adult male commoners to the state for a fixed span of weeks or months each year, alongside their regular labor in the fields. A farmer called to service might find himself assigned not to combat at all but to garrison duty along a quiet frontier post, to labor on the construction or repair of a defensive wall, or to the equally unglamorous work of transporting grain and supplies along the empire's slowly expanding network of roads and canals, tasks that, however far from the drama of battle, still required him to leave his fields and his family for long, uncertain stretches of time. Life at a frontier garrison, of the kind that lined the growing northern wall from the Warring States period onward, moved to its own particular, watchful rhythm, quite different from the busy seasonal labor of village life back home. Soldiers stationed at these remote outposts kept careful watch over the surrounding grassland for any sign of nomadic movement, maintained the mud brick or rammed earth sections of wall nearest their post, and passed long stretches of otherwise uneventful time in the company of a small garrison unit, their days structured around routine inspection, drill, and the patient, repetitive maintenance work that any isolated outpost requires simply to remain functional through the changing seasons. Surviving documents from Han-era frontier posts, written on wooden strips and preserved for centuries in the extremely dry desert climate of the Northwest, offer an unexpectedly intimate glimpse into this quiet garrison life. Inventories of grain and weapons, requests for replacement clothing as the cold season approached, brief personal notes exchanged between soldiers and their distant families, and careful daily logs recording nothing more dramatic than the weather and the routine changing. Of the watch, a bureaucratic record so thoroughly ordinary that it feels, read now across 2,000 years, almost like eavesdropping on the unremarkable daily business of people who never imagined anyone would read their words so long after they were written. When larger campaigns were called for, as during Emperor Wu's extended wars against the nomadic Xiongnu Confederation to the north, the scale of mobilization could be immense, drawing hundreds of thousands of conscripted soldiers and an even larger supporting network of laborers responsible for transporting grain, fodder, and equipment across enormous distances, since a Han army operating far into the northern grasslands could not easily forage for its own supplies in territory ill-suited to the kind of settled agriculture that sustained the army's home provinces. The logistics of simply keeping such an army fed and equipped, historians have noted, often proved a far more demanding and far more costly undertaking than the fighting itself, another quiet reminder that the patient, unglamorous work of supply and organization, rather than any single dramatic clash of arms, usually determined the outcome of ancient warfare. For the ordinary soldier himself, campaign life meant long marches under heavy pack, uncertain and often irregular supply, extended periods of illness and hardship in unfamiliar terrain, and, running through so much of the surviving poetry of the era, a persistent, quiet ache of homesickness for the fields, the family, and the familiar seasonal rhythms left behind. It is this quiet ache, rather than any triumphant account of victory, that echoes most clearly through the frontier poems that have survived from this period, verses describing snow falling on a distant garrison wall, or the long, unanswered wait for a letter from home, small and human and entirely recognizable across the full distance of 2,000 years. Beneath the more visible history of emperors and armies that has carried us through so much of tonight's journey, there ran another, quieter kind of history altogether, one measured not in battles or successions but in the patient, continuous movement of ordinary goods. Grain, salt, iron, cloth, and coin flowing slowly along roads and rivers and canals in a vast, largely invisible circulatory system that kept the whole enormous body of the empire quietly, steadily alive. Salt and iron, in particular, occupied a uniquely important place in the economic thinking of the ancient Chinese state, and by the Han Dynasty both had become, for long stretches of time, government monopolies, produced and sold under close official supervision rather than left to entirely open private enterprise. The reasoning behind this arrangement, debated at length in a famous Han-era court discussion recorded under the title Discourses on Salt and Iron, balanced two competing concerns that would recur again and again throughout Chinese economic history. The state's need for reliable revenue to fund its armies, its granaries, and its enormous administrative apparatus, weighed carefully against the risk that heavy-handed government control might stifle the ordinary, everyday commerce on which so many households depended for their livelihood. Salt itself, essential not only for seasoning food but for its preservation, particularly important in an age without refrigeration, was extracted through several different patient, labor-intensive methods depending on the region. Evaporated slowly from seawater along the coast in shallow ponds exposed to sun and wind, drawn up from deep brine wells sunk, in some remarkable cases, hundreds of feet into the earth using bamboo cable and simple percussion drilling techniques that represent one of the more quietly impressive engineering achievements of the ancient Chinese economy, or mined directly, in certain inland regions, from underground deposits of solid rock salt. Iron production, meanwhile, advanced through the Warring States and Han periods to a level of technical sophistication that would not be matched in Europe for well over 1,000 years, Chinese ironworkers having discovered, considerably earlier than their counterparts elsewhere, how to achieve the high furnace temperatures necessary to produce cast iron in significant quantities, using bellows, sometimes powered by patient teams of laborers and later by simple water wheel mechanisms, to force air into charcoal-fueled furnaces hot enough to melt the metal rather than merely soften it. This cast iron, poured into molds to produce plow tips, axe heads, and other agricultural tools at a scale and cost that simple hand-forged bronze implements could never match, quietly transformed the productivity of Chinese farming across the centuries we have traveled through tonight, allowing more land to be broken and cultivated with less human effort than ever before. Coinage, too, evolved gradually across this same long span of centuries, moving from early cast bronze pieces shaped, in certain regional variations, like small spades or knives, toward the simple, round bronze coin with a square center hole that would remain the basic form of Chinese currency for the following 2,000 years, its shape said by some later commentators to symbolize the roundness of heaven and the squareness of earth. Though such elegant explanations, appealing as they are, were likely applied after the fact to a shape whose real origins were probably far more practical, related simply to the convenience of stringing large quantities of coins together on a cord threaded through that same square hole. Markets, taxation, road maintenance, canal building, granary management. None of these carry the drama of a battlefield or a succession crisis, and yet it was this vast, quiet, endlessly patient machinery of ordinary economic life, more than any single emperor's decree, that determined whether a given dynasty's subjects went to bed each night with full stomachs or empty ones, and it is worth remembering, as we drift now toward the final chapters of tonight's long story, that the true, lasting measure of any ancient government's success was never really written in the grand inscriptions of its monuments, but in the small, largely unrecorded comfort or hardship of a single ordinary household's evening meal. We have spent a good portion of tonight with the great organized philosophies of ancient China, Confucian and Taoist and legalist alike, and with the careful, structured veneration of family ancestors that ran beneath so much of ordinary household life. But threaded quietly alongside these more formal traditions, across every dynasty we have visited tonight, ran an older, less systematic layer of belief in a wider unseen world, populated by nature spirits, local deities, and forces whose favor or displeasure was thought capable of shaping the fortunes of an entire village. Mountains, rivers, and other prominent natural features were widely believed, from the very earliest periods we have discussed tonight, to house their own resident spirits, capable of being pleased by proper offerings and angered by neglect or disrespect, and it was not uncommon, across the many centuries of dynastic history, for a local community, or even the emperor himself, to conduct formal sacrifices at a particular sacred mountain believed to hold special power over rainfall, harvest, or the general prosperity of the surrounding region. Mount Tai, in particular, rising alone from the relatively flat plains of the eastern province of Shandong, was venerated across nearly the entire span of Chinese history as one of the most sacred peaks in the realm, its summit visited by emperors performing solemn rites intended to formally report their achievements to heaven itself. Village life, too, was accompanied by a rich and largely informal tapestry of local spirit belief, quite distinct from the grand state rituals conducted at court. Household spirits believed to watch over the kitchen stove and report, at year's end, on the household's conduct to higher heavenly authorities. Guardian spirits of local wells, bridges, and crossroads offered small, quiet gestures of respect by passing travelers, and a persistent, widely shared belief in the ability of certain gifted individuals, shamans and mediums, to communicate directly with these spirits and with the recently deceased, offering guidance, healing, or warning to those who sought them out, a tradition considerably older than either Confucian or Taoist philosophy and one that continued to exist quietly alongside both throughout the centuries we have traveled tonight. As organized religious Taoism began to take shape toward the end of the Han Dynasty, drawing on the older philosophical Taoism of Laozi and Zhuangzi but developing it into something considerably more structured, with its own priesthood, its own rituals of healing and purification, and its own promise of communal salvation, it absorbed and reorganized a great deal of this older, looser layer of nature and spirit worship into a more formal religious framework, a process that would continue to develop and deepen across the centuries following the Han Dynasty's eventual collapse, well beyond the boundary of tonight's particular journey. Divination, too, in forms considerably more accessible than the royal oracle bone ceremonies of the distant Shang court, remained a constant, quiet presence in ordinary life across every period we have discussed tonight, whether through the consultation of a professional diviner before an important decision, the reading of natural omens such as the flight patterns of birds or the unusual behavior of domestic animals, or from at least the Zhou dynasty onward, the careful, patient consultation of the Book of Changes, a text built around 64 hexagram patterns whose particular combinations were believed to offer guidance on questions ranging from military strategy to the timing of a marriage, its layered, deliberately ambiguous interpretations inviting long, careful, unhurried reflection rather than any single quick answer. It is fitting, perhaps, that a night built around slow drifting and quiet uncertainty should close this particular thread with an acknowledgement of mystery rather than resolution, that alongside every careful philosophy and every organized ritual we have discussed tonight, ordinary people across 3,000 years of Chinese history also lived, quite comfortably, alongside an unseen world they could not fully explain, tending it with small, regular gestures of respect, and trusting in the same patient way they trusted the turning of the seasons, that such quiet attentiveness would be, in the end, enough. There is a particular comfort available to us, tonight of all nights, in that same quiet trust. We do not need to resolve every mystery before we rest, any more than the ancient farmer standing before his kitchen stove shrine needed a complete theological explanation before he offered his small, sincere evening gesture of respect. It is enough, sometimes, simply to acknowledge the presence of something larger and quieter than ourselves, to make our own small gesture toward rest, and to trust the rest to unfold on its own unhurried schedule, exactly as it always has. Before we let our long night's journey settle finally toward its close, there is one more quiet thread worth following for a little while. The slow, patient development of medicine and healing across the centuries we have traveled through tonight, a tradition concerned, in the end, with the same universal human hope that has accompanied every civilization in every age, the hope of easing pain and extending the comfort of ordinary life. The earliest layer of Chinese medical thought, visible already in the oracle bone questions we discussed earlier tonight, treated illness largely as a matter of ancestral or spiritual displeasure, to be addressed through proper offering and ritual rather than through anything resembling what we would today call physical treatment. Over the following centuries, however, alongside this older spiritual framework, a more systematic body of medical theory gradually developed, reaching a particularly influential early expression in a text known as the Yellow Emperor's Inner Classic, compiled and expanded over several centuries around the Han Dynasty period, structured as a series of calm, patient dialogues between the legendary Yellow Emperor and his physician. This emerging medical tradition organized the workings of the human body around the concept of qi, a vital energy or life force believed to circulate through the body along defined pathways, and around the complementary, ever-balancing forces of yin and yang, whose harmony or imbalance was thought to underlie health and illness alike, in a framework that mirrored, in its broad outlines, the same emphasis on balance and natural harmony that ran through Taoist philosophy more generally. Illness, in this understanding, arose not from a single external invading cause alone but more often from some disruption in the body's internal balance, brought on perhaps by improper diet, emotional excess, unfavorable seasonal exposure, or simple overexertion, and treatment, correspondingly, sought to restore that lost balance rather than to attack a single isolated symptom. Acupuncture, the careful insertion of fine needles at specific points along the body's mapped energy pathways, developed as one of the signature techniques of this tradition, requiring a practitioner's patient, detailed knowledge of the body's many distinct pathway points and years of careful hands-on training to apply safely and effectively. Herbal medicine developed alongside it with equal patience and complexity, drawing on an enormous and steadily expanding body of accumulated knowledge about the properties of plants, minerals, and, more rarely, animal products, compiled gradually across generations into pharmacological reference texts that grew, edition by edition, ever more comprehensive as new remedies were tested, recorded, and passed down. Physicians themselves occupied a somewhat ambiguous social position across the centuries we have discussed tonight, respected for their genuinely useful skill and yet ranked, in the formal Confucian social hierarchy that placed scholars and officials at its peak, below the more prestigious path of civil administration, so that a family with a particularly promising son more often hoped to see him pass the official examinations and enter government service than to see him take up the equally demanding, if less prestigious, study of medicine. And yet skilled physicians could and did achieve real fame and lasting reputation, none more so than the Han-era physician Hua Tuo, remembered in later tradition for his skill in surgery and for developing an early anesthetic preparation that allowed him, according to admiring later accounts, to perform operations that would otherwise have been unbearably painful for the patient to endure. Public health measures, too, however limited by the standards of a much later age, received real attention from the more capable governments we have discussed tonight, particularly during periods of Han prosperity, when officials oversaw the maintenance of granaries intended not only for tax storage but for emergency relief during famine, organized basic quarantine measures during outbreaks of contagious illness, and, in at least some recorded instances, distributed medical supplies and dispatched physicians to regions afflicted by epidemic disease, a quiet, practical expression of the same Confucian ideal of benevolent governance we have returned to so many times tonight, the belief that a ruler's virtue ought to be measured, in the end, not by grand monuments but by the ordinary well-being of the humblest household under his care. There is something fitting, on a night devoted so entirely to rest, in closing this particular thread with the reminder that ancient Chinese medicine, for all its unfamiliar theoretical framework, was built around exactly the same patient attentiveness to balance, to rhythm, and to the careful, unhurried restoration of a body's natural harmony that has run beneath so much of tonight's story, and that the simple, universal act of tending carefully to one's own rest and recovery, the very thing you are doing now, would have been perfectly familiar, in its essential spirit, to a healer standing beside a patient's bed 2,000 years ago. Not every hour of ancient Chinese life, even among the most dutiful Confucian officials, was spent in labor or ritual, and it is worth spending a little more time tonight, as our journey draws gently toward its final chapter, on the quieter pleasures that ancient Chinese civilization gradually cultivated across these same long centuries. Gardens, tea, and the unhurried art of simply resting well. The earliest Chinese gardens, associated with royal parks maintained by Shang and Zhou rulers for hunting and ritual purposes, gradually evolved, across the following centuries, into something more contemplative and more intimately scaled, particularly among the scholar officials of the Han and later periods, who came to view a carefully composed garden, however modest in size, as a kind of private landscape in miniature, arranged with the same patient, deliberate attention given to a piece of calligraphy or a carefully brewed cup of tea. Rocks, chosen for their weathered irregular shapes, were positioned to suggest distant mountains. A small pool or winding stream might suggest a great river reduced to intimate scale, and slow-growing trees, pines and bamboo especially, were prized precisely because their gradual, patient growth across a human lifetime mirrored the values of endurance and quiet strength so often praised in Confucian and Taoist writing alike. Tea, though it would not reach the elaborate, ritualized prominence of later Chinese dynasties until some centuries after the close of our own story tonight, has roots that reach back, in more modest form, into the Han period and possibly earlier still, beginning as a medicinal preparation valued for its stimulating and digestive properties before gradually, across the following centuries, taking on the more purely pleasurable and social role it would eventually come to hold. Even in these earlier centuries, the careful, unhurried preparation of a warm beverage, The quiet ritual of boiling water, measuring leaf, and waiting patiently for the proper infusion offered exactly the kind of small, repeated, calming ceremony that fits naturally alongside everything else we have discussed tonight about the value ancient Chinese culture placed on patient, deliberate attention to small things. Poetry, too, offered its own quiet form of leisure and reflection, composed not only for formal court occasions but for private pleasure among friends, exchanged in letters between distant colleagues, or written simply for oneself as a way of marking a particular moment of quiet observation. A sudden autumn rain, the sound of geese passing overhead at dusk, the simple, wordless comfort of an old friend's company shared over a cup of wine. The Han dynasty in particular saw the flourishing of a poetic form called fu, elaborate descriptive rhapsodies that lingered, often at considerable and unhurried length, over the careful description of a single palace, a single hunting expedition, or a single object of beauty, less concerned with narrative momentum than with the slow, accumulating pleasure of detailed observation, not entirely unlike the patient, wandering shape of the story we ourselves have been following tonight. Board games, too, offered their own quiet form of evening leisure across these centuries, most notably a strategic game called weiqi, played with black and white stones on a grid board, its rules simple enough to learn quickly and yet its strategic depth considerable enough to reward a lifetime of careful, patient study, prized among scholars precisely because mastery of the game was thought to cultivate the same qualities of patience, foresight, and calm strategic thinking valued in Confucian. Self-cultivation more broadly. And beneath all of these more refined pleasures, the ordinary rhythms of festival and season offered their own regular, anticipated moments of rest and gathering throughout the year. The Lunar New Year, marked from ancient times with family reunion and careful ritual observance. The Mid-Autumn Gathering, timed to the full moon of the 8th lunar month, when families gathered to share food and admire the moon together, a custom whose gentle, quiet pleasure in simply sitting together beneath the night sky feels, even now, entirely recognizable, entirely close to the spirit in which we ourselves have spent this whole long night together. It is fitting, perhaps, to let this particular thread close on that image of ancient families gathered quietly beneath a full moon with no more urgent purpose than simply being present together for a little while, because it captures, better than any single dynasty or philosophy we have discussed tonight, the deeper and more universal thread running beneath the entire long history of ancient China, the patient, recurring human effort to build small pockets of rest, beauty, and quiet, companionship into lives that were, in every century we have visited tonight, also filled with considerable and unavoidable labor. One last quiet thread deserves our attention before we let this long night's journey finally settle toward sleep. The enormous, patient network of roads, canals, and postal relay stations that gradually bound the vast Chinese landscape together across the centuries we have traveled through tonight, the empire's own slow, steady bloodstream, carrying goods, information, and people across distances that would otherwise have kept its many regions hopelessly isolated from one another. The Qin dynasty, in the brief years following unification, undertook a road-building program of extraordinary scale, constructing wide, carefully engineered highways radiating outward from the capital toward every corner of the newly unified realm, their surfaces reinforced and their width standardized, according to later accounts, to allow the passage of 3 chariots abreast, a scale of infrastructure investment that later Han officials, inheriting and extending this network, found themselves grateful to have received largely intact. Canals, too, played an equally vital and equally patient role in binding the empire together, particularly in linking the wheat-growing north with the rice-rich south, since moving heavy quantities of grain overland by cart was far slower and far more costly than moving the same quantity by boat along a well-maintained waterway. Considerable state resources were devoted, across the centuries we have discussed tonight, to the digging, dredging, and careful maintenance of these canals, work that, like so much else in this story, proceeded not through any single dramatic effort but through the patient, repeated labor of conscripted laborers working season after season, year after year, gradually deepening and extending channels that would serve the empire's grain transport for centuries to come. Along the major roads, at carefully measured intervals, relay stations maintained fresh horses and lodging for official couriers carrying urgent government correspondence, allowing a message from a distant frontier garrison to reach the capital in a matter of days rather than the weeks it might otherwise have required, a system of communication that, while modest by later standards, gave the Han government a real and valuable capacity to respond to distant crises with far greater speed than the sheer size of its territory might otherwise have allowed. It is worth resting, one final time tonight, on the quiet, unglamorous patience embedded in all of this infrastructure. The thousands of laborers who dug each mile of canal, the anonymous road engineers who calculated gradients and drainage, the relay station keepers who kept fresh horses ready through long, uneventful nights on the chance that an urgent message might arrive. None of them appear by name in the grand narratives of emperors and dynasties we have followed tonight, and yet it was their accumulated, patient labor, mile by mile, station by station, that made it possible for so vast and so varied a civilization to function, at all, as a single connected whole. Postal runners, carrying only a light pouch of sealed documents, were trained to cover their assigned stretch of road at a steady, sustainable pace rather than an exhausting sprint, handing their pouch off to the next runner waiting at the following station in a slow, continuous relay that might carry a single message hundreds of miles within only a handful of days, each individual runner responsible for nothing more than his own short, familiar stretch of road, covered so many times that he could likely have run it with his eyes closed in rain or clear night alike, before finally passing the message onward and at last resting. Picture, if you like, one particular relay station keeper on one particular quiet night, somewhere along a dusty stretch of road between two provinces whose names have long since changed. His lantern burns low. His horses stand ready in their stalls, unbothered, half asleep themselves. No message has come for hours, and none may come before dawn. He is simply waiting, patiently, the way so much of this entire story has asked us to wait tonight, trusting that his small, steady post in the darkness matters, even though no one will ever record his name, even though the empire he quietly serves will, in time, like every empire in this story, eventually give way to another. Let him stand watch a little longer in your mind as we turn, now, at last, toward the very end of our journey. And so, slowly, we arrive at the end of our long journey through the ancient world of China, from the quiet river villages of the Yellow and Yangtze valleys, through the bronze rituals of the Shang, the philosophical flowering of the Zhou, the sweeping unification of the Qin, and the long-settled prosperity of the Han. What followed after 220 CE was a different story, an age of division and eventual reunification that belongs to another night, another journey we might take together another time. What is worth carrying with you now, as your own eyes grow heavy, is not any single date or dynasty but the overall shape of the story. A slow accumulation, century after century, of villages into states, states into empires, and empires into a lasting civilization whose writing system, whose philosophical traditions, and whose very sense of itself as a continuous, unbroken story reach unbroken across more than 3,000 years, all the way down to the present moment. Think, for a moment, of everything that had to happen quietly, patiently, almost invisibly, for that long continuity to exist at all. The first Yangshao farmer who noticed that millet grew better in one particular patch of soil than another. The first Longshan potter who discovered that a faster spinning wheel produced a thinner, more elegant wall. The unnamed Shang diviner who carved a question into bone and could not have known that scholars, 3,000 years later, would read his careful handwriting by electric light. The anonymous Zhou farmer whose small, unremarkable poem about mending roofs before winter was copied, and copied again, and preserved across so many centuries that we can still, tonight, hear an echo of his voice. None of these people set out to build a civilization that would last 3,000 years. Each of them was simply attending, as carefully and patiently as they could, to the small, immediate tasks in front of them. A field to be planted, a bone to be read, a vessel to be shaped, a child to be raised according to old and careful custom. It was only the sheer accumulated weight of so many small, patient acts, repeated across so many generations, that eventually produced something as vast and enduring as the civilization we have spent this whole night quietly walking through. You, too, tonight need do nothing more than that. There is no grand task waiting for you at the end of this story, no test of what you have retained, no requirement that you carry any of it forward into tomorrow with any effort at all. The only task left, if it can even be called a task, is the same small, patient one that has carried this entire civilization across 3,000 years. Simply to rest, quietly and without hurry, exactly where you are. The rivers that watched the first Yangshao farmers plant their millet are the same rivers that watched the terracotta army take shape beneath the earth. The same rivers that carried Han silk slowly westward toward distant lands. They are still flowing tonight, somewhere on the other side of the world, quiet and patient and entirely unconcerned with how long any of it takes. Consider, too, everything we have quietly gathered along the way tonight, beyond the familiar march of dynasties. The slow art of writing, refined stroke by stroke across 3,000 years. The careful astronomers watching the same turning stars, night after patient night. The soldiers on a distant frontier wall, homesick for a warm kitchen and a familiar bed. The women tending silkworms and households alike. Their steady labor rarely recorded yet always essential. The physicians seeking balance rather than conquest over the body's ailments. The families gathered beneath an autumn moon, wanting nothing more for one quiet evening than each other's company. None of these threads are loud. All of them, woven together across so many centuries, are what actually made the story endure. Let that patience be the last thought you carry with you. There is no need to hurry toward morning. Let the centuries settle, let the names and dates blur softly together, let the rivers keep flowing quietly on without you, and let yourself, at last, drift all the way down into sleep.